All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today and being a part of our workshop on programmatic environmental impact statements for energy facilities. Next slide, please. So again, thank you for being here. We're going to talk about what we call our PEISs, or the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statements for Clean Energy. Ecology and EFSEC are holding this joint training as a way to help you to use the PEISs. And how we use the PEISs can be very similar, and you may have some projects that include aspects of more than one of these. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through and provide you some information about what we've provided in the documents and some tools and guidance as well. So for introductions, I'm Diane Buterak. I'm the section manager for Ecology's Clean Energy Coordination section. We also have Mark Daniel, Andrew Hollenbaugh, and Amelia Fujikawa here from Ecology, and Sean Green from the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council, or EFSEC. Next slide, please. So our agenda today is to start off with an overview of the PEISs, talk a little bit about the contents in those documents, how local governments can use the PEISs for projects. We'll talk about implementation resources. We may take a break depending on where we are in the process, and then we'll go into a group exercise. We'll talk about some hypothetical project scenarios and walk through those so you can see how the documents can be used. We'll also be taking questions at the end of each agenda item. So I'll turn it back now to Amelia, who has a couple of questions for the group.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and launch a couple polls here. Let's see. Should see them popping up on your screen in 1 second. It's just 2 questions. There we go. It's also in the chat. So first one is, describe your level of experience with the PEISs that have been prepared for clean energy projects in Washington. And then the second question is, which of the PEISs are you most interested in learning about? Select all that apply. We've got transmission, utility scale solar, utility scale onshore wind, and green hydrogen. Looks like everyone's answered. Let's see. For some reason, it's not letting me look at the results, but I see that there are answers in there, so thank you. With that, I can pass it on to Andrew.
Okay, I'm going to dive into the first item on the agenda, an overview of the PEISs. All the PEISs we are talking about today have their origins in legislative directives. In recent years, the legislature has directed the preparation of 5 of them. The legislature directed Ecology to lead the preparation for PEISs for utility-scale solar energy facilities, utility-scale onshore wind energy facilities, green hydrogen facilities, and alternative jet fuel facilities. The legislature directed EFSEC to lead the preparation of a PEIS for electrical transmission facilities with nominal voltage of 230 kilovolts or greater. All of these have been completed with the exception of the PEIS for alternative jet fuel facilities, which will be completed mid-2027. What is a PEIS? PEIS is a type of non-project environmental review. As the PEISs stem from legislative directives, all the PEISs are prepared under SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act. Here are some key points about the PEISs. A PEIS provides environmental review at a broad level. It identifies potential impacts and ways to avoid and minimize those impacts. It identifies possible mitigation for those impacts and serves as a source of constant information. A PEIS does not approve or deny a project, consider any specific projects or locations, or take away any state or local authorities. How can these PEISs be used? They can be used as a source of constant and transparent information about energy facilities by anyone with an interest, such as project developers, SEPA lead agencies, permitting agencies, tribes, interested parties, and the public. They can be used to help developers understand potential impacts and make siting and design decisions that can avoid or reduce impacts from the start. And they can be used to identify how potential impacts could be mitigated. The legislature set forth some specific requirements for the use of the PEISs. We'll be talking about that more later, but in short, SEPA lead agencies must consider and use a PEIS when conducting environmental review for an applicable energy project. The graphic on this slide shows the project environmental review begins with a PEIS, is built upon by project level environmental review, with project permitting occurring after that. Okay, now are there any questions before we move on?
It doesn't sound like it. So yeah, with that overview, Sean and I are going to be talking about the actual contents of the PEISs. Our discussion is going to be structured around common elements that the PEISs all share. Some common elements that the PEISs share include the following: alternatives, or the types of facilities studied, a geographic scope of study, descriptions of the affected environment, identification of potential impacts, and identification of measures to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts. Next slide, please. Okay, starting with the PEIS alternatives, or the types of facilities evaluated. This slide shows the specific alternatives evaluated in each of the completed PEISs. You'll notice that as required by SEPA, each PEIS includes a no-action alternative. In all of the PEISs, the no-action alternative represents a case where project environmental review and permitting occurs without the PEIS as a reference document. The solar and wind PEISs have similar action alternatives, so I'm going to talk about them together. Each of those PEISs has an alternative for a basic utility scale energy facility. Each one also has an alternative that adds a battery energy storage system to the basic energy facility, as well as an alternative that adds agricultural uses to the basic facility. The green hydrogen PEIS has an action alternative for a production facility, an alternative that adds a battery energy storage system to the production facility, and there's also an alternative for a storage facility. And now passing it over to Sean.
Yeah, sorry about that. The transmission programmatic EIS has a single action alternative, which is the development of new overhead and underground transmission facilities, though we did divide our analysis into different types or phases of transmission projects, including new construction, upgrade of existing lines, minor modification of existing lines, and operation. So now we're going to move on to the next common element of the programmatic EISs share, a geographic scope of study. We're going to take a look at the geographic scopes of study for each programmatic EIS, moving from the largest to the smallest extent. Shown on the slide in front of you now is the geographic scope for the transmission programmatic EIS. It includes all lands in the state of Washington except for tribal lands, isolated islands that would require undersea cables, and oceanic areas. Additionally, we determined that transmission lines laid on or trenched in the substrate of water bodies were beyond the technical scope of this programmatic due to their unique and project-specific concerns. Lines that span water bodies overhead or under the substrate through horizontal directional drilling are still included within the scope. The analysis within the transmission programmatic EIS was developed for projects within its geographic scope. So projects outside of that scope can still use the document as technical support, but additional project level SEPA review would be needed in that scenario.
Alrighty, on this slide is the geographic scope for the onshore wind programmatic environmental impact statement. This geographic scope of study was developed based on where there are lands suitable for wind energy facilities in proximity to existing transmission lines. Various other lands were then categorically excluded from the study area, such as state parks and tribal reservations. Next slide, please. On this slide is the geographic scope for the solar PEIS. The geographic scope of this study was developed based on where there are lands suitable for solar facilities in proximity to existing transmission lines. As for onshore wind, various other lands were then categorically excluded. We can see that, unsurprisingly, the geographic scope of study for the solar PEIS predominantly consists of lands east of the Cascades. And next slide, please. And lastly, we have the geographic scope of study for the green hydrogen PEIS, which has the smallest extent of all of them. This is because the scope of study is limited to areas zoned for industrial or industrial supporting uses that are located in proximity to key infrastructure. I'd like to point out here that for the utility scale onshore wind, solar, and green hydrogen PEISs, their use at the project level is not strictly limited to projects proposed within the geographic scopes of study you just saw. However, any differences with the analysis of the PEIS resulting from a location outside of the geographic scope of study would need to be identified and considered in the project level environmental review. And next slide, please. For each of the geographic scopes of study, the affected environment consisted of the resources shown on this slide. The resources include all of the SEPA elements of the environment. Additionally, the resources also include two specifically directed by the legislature: environmental justice and overburdened communities, as well as tribal rights, interests, and resources. And next slide, please.
So the programmatic EIS is analyzed for potential impacts to potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts on all of the resources at a broad level. Given SEPA's focus on significant impacts, the programmatic EISs are similarly focused on identifying the potential significant impacts of the energy facilities that were studied. However, project-specific environmental review is still needed to fully determine a project's impact. These programmatics do not substitute for project-level review. To help with identifying where impacts may be more likely to occur, all of the programmatic EISs have maps or references to mapping resources. For the transmission programmatic EIS, we produced a series of sensitivity maps for 14 of the primary SEPA resource categories. These maps display the location of a variety of environmental resources specific to each category and assign them a sensitivity level from between 1 and 3, with 3 being the highest. And just to demonstrate what they look like, I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Okay, looks like that works. So this is land and shoreline use. For example, these maps are found on EFSEC's eProgrammatic, which is kind of a virtual interface for our programmatic EIS. For using land and shoreline, this is sensitivity level 2, which includes things like prime farmlands, state and national parks, and the like. This is military operations sensitivity level 2, which is mostly special use airspace with a floor elevation between 200 and 500 feet. This is sensitivity level 3, which is nationally federally designated wilderness areas as well as commercial airports. And this is military operations level 3, which is special use airspace with a floor elevation. And when all of those sensitivity maps are combined, you're presented with something like this. This overlays all the various resources with their assigned sensitivity levels and kind of provides like a heat map of areas where there is a higher concentration of potentially sensitive resources for specific to transmission projects. These maps should ideally help you identify and assess potentially impacted environmental resources during your SEPA review, and ideally would be used by you and by applicants very early on in the process to select routing corridors that avoid areas of high sensitivity. I'll hand the screen back. And next slide. Thank you. So the programmatic EISs have a large number of measures designed to avoid, minimize, and mitigate for impacts of associated projects. As we'll see, the ecology and EFSEC programmatics have different approaches to these measures, but at a high level, all the programmatic EISs have two types of measures. those that are assumed to be applied to all projects as a baseline for the application of the analysis within the programmatic EISs, and additional measures that can be applied by CP lead agencies as needed to address specific impacts associated with individual projects and individual locations. So for the transmission programmatic EIS, we crafted a few technical terms that have definitions specific to this document and are therefore unlikely to be familiar with you regardless of your level of expertise with EISs or with SEPA. The first term is what we call general measures. These are procedures that are assumed all projects will adhere to as part of their use of the programmatic EIS. They primarily serve as a baseline for being able to use the analysis in the programmatic uniformly. So these are generally things like the project will be consistent with state and local rules and regulations. The second term is avoidance criteria. These are criteria that limit the scope of the environmental review and provide a consistent baseline for evaluating the potential impacts of project-specific applications. These criteria became especially important as we assessed impacts to resources that are traditionally difficult to mitigate for, such as traditional cultural properties or TCPs. When considering a resource such as a TCP in a statewide context, avoidance was seen as the only type of mitigation that could be determined to mitigate for potentially significant impacts to the resource under all circumstances. It's important to note that these avoidance criteria should not be considered as a firm mitigation requirement for all projects using the programmatic EIS, but are rather the only way that we could guarantee a finding of non-significance at a programmatic level, which is something that we were required to do by the originating legislation. It is possible that project-specific conditions and mitigation can reach a determination of non-significance without adhering to our avoidance criteria, but that's ultimately a decision that will be made by you as the project-level CP lead agency. Finally, mitigation measures are generally measures designed to address anticipated impacts to environmental resources. The transmission programmatic EIS recommends that these measures be implemented when appropriate. The determination on when that mitigation is relevant to a particular project and the decision on whether the mitigation is reasonable to impose in the context of that project specifically will again be made by the project level CP lead agency.
Okay, as was mentioned, ecology and the EFSEC PEISs have different approaches to the measures to avoid, reduce, and mitigate impacts. The utility scale solar, utility scale onshore wind, and green hydrogen PEISs have 5 categories. The first category is general measures, which apply to all projects using the PEISs. Next are recommended measures for siting and design, which include a variety of measures that can help set a project up for success. The required measures must be implemented to use each PEIS if they're applicable. There's a second recommended measures category for the construction, operation, and decommissioning phases of a project. Finally, mitigation measures for potential significant impacts are provided where such impacts have been identified. Okay, we're going to pause again to check and see if we have any questions before we move on. Okay, it doesn't sound like it, so Sean, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Good. So now that we've covered the basic contents of the programmatic EISs, we're going to talk a bit about how local governments can use them for projects that they're reviewing. Most of the types of facilities within the scope of these programmatic EISs can optionally pursue permitting through EFSEC or through the county sewer conditional use permit or some other mechanism. The one exception is very high voltage transmission lines that cross multiple utility and county boundaries or across state lines. Those facilities are required by rule to site through EFSEC. When you are the primary permitting agency, you will often serve as a CP lead agency as well, which means you will have the responsibility to review and apply the relative programmatic EISs accordingly. You can share co-lead status or transfer lead agency status to another local or state government agency by mutual agreement. And counties with fewer than 18,000 residents also have the option of requiring a state agency to take that lead.
Okay, so Sean talked about when a local government might be lead agency. I'm now going to talk about some of the legislative directives that apply to lead agencies when they're handling projects addressed by the PEISs. These directives are found deep down in the SEPA statute in RCW sections 4321C408 and 538. These two sections respectively address transmission and clean energy projects. However, all the language I'm going to mention is found in both sections. The first excerpt on this slide says that a lead agency must consider a PEIS to identify and mitigate project-level probable significant adverse environmental impacts. The next excerpt says that during project-level environmental review, the lead agency must address any probable significant adverse environmental impacts associated with the proposal that were not analyzed in a PEIS and identify any mitigation measures specific to the project to address those impacts. This hits on some of the key responsibilities of lead agencies when using the PEISs. Determining if there are any probable significant adverse environmental impacts associated with the proposal that were not analyzed in the applicable PEIS, and identifying any additional mitigation measures needed to address those. And next slide, please. Okay, so the next one says that if a project is following the mitigation measures identified in a PEIS, the project is considered to have mitigated its probable significant impacts of the project unless other such impacts were identified during project level review. So any additional measures for mitigation need to be clearly tied to probable significant impacts that were not addressed in a PEIS. Finally, the last directive says that lead agencies shall use a PEIS through specific methods in accordance with SEPA. Essentially, this means that an applicable PEIS has to be formally included in the SEPA's lead agency's decision-making using one of the usual methods under SEPA, such as adopting the PEIS and issuing a mitigated determination of non-significance, or preparing a supplemental environmental impact statement. Okay, we're going to pause once more to check on, see if there's any questions at this point. Okay, so I am seeing one in the chat here. See, it says when the exception occurs, taking lead agency out of the local government authority, what role can the local government play in ensuring local concerns are addressed prior to determination of impact of non-significance?
Yes, so when there is a project where EFSEC is the lead agency, EFSEC does have the authority to supersede local rules and regulations in its review if it deems necessary. But we do not, we make no effort to exclude local governments from our review process. SEPA still has several avenues available to participate in the review, either as a coordinating agency, a co-lead agency, or just an agency that is consulted during the process of the SEPA review. EFSEC also has, by rule, other avenues like the land use consistency hearings and determinations and the adjudication process, where local governments are still intrinsically involved.
Thanks for that, Sean. Any other questions at all before we move on? Okay, not seeing any here. So yeah, maybe we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so to help users of the PEISs, including local governments, with implementing them, there are a variety of resources available. And next slide, please. Thank you. Ecology's PEIS webpage has several resources related to the utility scale solar, utility scale onshore wind, and green hydrogen PEISs. The overall aim for these resources is to make the environmental review process for projects using the PEISs as easy and efficient as possible. However, use of all the resources is optional. Starting off, we have some focus sheets, which are short 2-page documents that are intended to help people quickly understand what the PEISs are all about. There are 3 focus sheets tailored to different audiences. One is for general audiences, another is for project developers, and the third is for local governments. For each PIS, we have a project siting and design worksheet and a project consistency worksheet. These worksheets can help project developers and lead agencies assess a project's consistency with the 5 categories of measures in the PEISs to avoid, reduce, and mitigate impacts that I talked about earlier. These worksheets provide a central location to systematically track and document a project's consistency with a PEIS. Not only does this help promote an efficient environmental review process, this also helps create a strong project record. Also on our webpage, we have compiled links to several online mapping resources, making it easy to find and access key spatial information that is particularly relevant for project siting and design. We also have some SEPA adoption templates available for lead agencies to use. Currently, we have a template available for when a lead agency is adopting a PEIS and issuing a mitigated determination of non-significance, and another for when adopting a PEIS and preparing a supplemental environmental impact statement.
EFSEC also has several tools to assist in implementation. The eProgrammatic is, in essence, an interactive digital interface for the transmission programmatic EIS that provides ready access to the identified impacts and recommended mitigation. This also includes several auto-populating checklists that we adopted from Ecology's versions that applicants can fill out to include with their application materials. These checklists will provide the applicants rationale for determining that their project fits under the geographic and technical scope of the transmission programmatic EIS, and creates a record of the project's degree of conformance with the transmission programmatic EIS's recommendations. Additionally, we have what we call a route analysis tool. This allows users to draw or import a proposed corridor into an interactive GIS version of those sensitivity maps that I showed you before, at which point you are instantly presented with information on the sensitive environmental resources that may interact with the project cited within that corridor. And finally, Ecology's SEPA webpage has a wealth of general information on SEPA. And I see we have a question to follow up on the previous answer. Can additional mitigation efforts be required by EFSEC prior to EFSEC determination in order to address local government concerns? And sorry, I couldn't type so fast. No problem there. Let's see. Yes, so EFSEC can impose any mitigation that it deems necessary at any point in the preparation of the SEPA review, whether that goes to a mitigated determination of non-significance or an EIS. Additionally, after the SEPA review, the EFSEC Council has independent authority to impose additional mitigation measures beyond those recommended in the SEPA materials based on their determinations during, again, those adjudication hearings or their interpretation of comments received from the public or from local governments. So the best avenue for local governments ensuring that their concerns are incorporated into the review and that their recommended mitigation is imposed would be to respond to EFSEC's outreach efforts throughout the process, fully participate in the adjudication hearings, and submit comments during the various public comment periods that are associated with EFSEC's review. And every member of the council reads every public comment received for all of our projects, as well as our staff. We make a determined effort to ensure that concerns that are raised are appropriately addressed in the final decision. Are there any other questions before we take a short break? Okay. Next slide, please.
Okay, that concludes the presentation part of today. That said, If you have any questions at all related to the PEISs in the future, you can feel free to reach out to Sean or myself. But we want to thank you very much for taking the time to learn about the PEISs.